Hi, this is the Anarcha Archive. I'm J.C. Hallman. In the past few videos, we've been exploring how Anarcha, the most consequential of the experimental subjects of the so-called father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims, left Alabama. We saw from case records in New York that she had been experimented on further by a man named Charles Bell Gibson. In other words, the woman who was supposed to have been Sims' first cure wasn't actually cured. As we'll be seeing, that's going to be true for the rest of her life.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
This is Charles Bell Gibson. He was the son of William Gibson, the head of surgery at the University of Pennsylvania, which in the early 19th century was the top medical school in the United States. J. Marion Sims attended Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia. Not quite as good as UPenn, but it was right at the time William Gibson was performing many high-profile public surgeries. Charles Bell Gibson was named for a famous English surgeon, Charles Bell, and he was one of the first surgeons in the United States to perform the surgery for obstetric fistula that Sims had described in an 1852 paper. Although much of it is misleading, Sims' first fistula paper is even today considered a classic in the history of medicine. I'll be taking that apart in a future video. In 1853, Charles Bell Gibson was described as having performed surgery on a fistula case, a young woman with a fistula of 7 years standing. The woman is not identified, but 7 years prior to 1853 is 1846, right at about the same time Anarcha acquired her fistula. It's not a certainty, but the woman being described here is possibly Anarcha. So how is that possible? What the case record from Woman's Hospital in New York City shows unequivocally is that Charles Bell Gibson experimented on Anarcha several times in Richmond, right around 1853 to 1855, using chloroform. The question I had after I first saw this document was, okay, but where in Richmond?
That turns out to be here, the Egyptian building in downtown Richmond, Virginia. Charles Bell Gibson was one of the founders of a new medical school that for a time was located in another part of Virginia, but then it moved in here. For some time, the Egyptian building was the medical school, and Gibson was its lead surgeon. It was a hospital, too, with facilities for both black and white patients. This turns out to be very close to the site of what was known as Lumpkin's Jail, an infamous slave pen in Richmond. It's really just a couple of blocks away. A great deal of work has been done to preserve this site, and there's this area, and there's a historic burial ground on the other side of a major road over here. But all of it is below this major highway that runs right above it.
Lumpkin's Jail was infamous. It was described in Solomon Northrop's book, 12 Years a Slave. The book was published right at this time, in 1853. So Gibson would have experimented on Anarcha here, in the Egyptian building. There were a couple possible locations inside the building for this, but the most likely is that he would have performed experiments in the main lecture hall, so they could be observed by hundreds of students. Evidence of the connection between Gibson and Sims isn't only circumstantial. Gibson's later lectures on Sims would be recalled by his students for many years. And during the Civil War, Gibson wrote a letter to Sims. Gibson was the head surgeon for the Army of Virginia. He wrote to Sims to request a donation to aid in the creation of prosthetic devices for the war's many amputees. There's no evidence that Sims ever replied to the letter. Gibson also knew the Maury family. As we documented in earlier videos, Anarcha came to be owned by a man named William L. Maury, cousin to Matthew Fontaine Maury, the father of oceanography. Incidentally, Matthew Fontaine Maury's statue in Richmond was recently removed, just like Sims' statue in New York City.
Also in a previous video, I indicated that there were Maurys all across the country: New York, Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama. And there was a prominent Maury who lived right here, in this house. This, too, is just a couple of blocks away from the Egyptian building, where Anarcha was enduring further surgical experiments.
That begins to answer the question of how ownership of Anarcha passed from Nathan Harris, as we described in a previous video, to William L. Maury, the name on the case record in New York City. To reiterate, the case record indicates that Anarcha was experimented on in Richmond, and that she was owned by a Maury.
The Egyptian Building Medical School was eventually folded into Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, and this home is now the VCU Alumni House. Anarcha was experimented on 2 blocks in that direction, and members of the Maury family were coming and going right from this house here.
Next time, we'll offer a little more detail on how and why that transfer of ownership took place.
Whoa,